Dr. Amelia Washington adjusted her white coat as she entered Preston's pharmacy on Fifth Avenue, exhausted after a grueling 16-hour shift at Metropolitan General Hospital. The emergency room had been particularly brutal that day. 3 car accident victims, 2 heart attacks, and a child with severe asthma who reminded her why she'd chosen medicine in the first place. All she wanted was to pick up her prescribed migraine medication and get home to her small apartment. The pharmacy was nearly empty at 11:47 p.m., with only the night pharmacist, an elderly customer counting pills, and a security guard she'd never seen before standing near the entrance. As she approached the prescription counter, Dr. Washington noticed the guard watching her intently, his hand resting on his belt in a way that made her uncomfortable. She'd experienced this kind of scrutiny before, the suspicious glances, the assumption that a young black woman couldn't possibly belong in professional spaces, the presumption of guilt that followed her despite her medical degree, her spotless record, and her dedication to saving lives. "Can I help you?" asked the pharmacist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who recognized Dr. Washington from previous visits. "I'm here to pick up a prescription for Amelia Washington," she said, reaching into her purse for her ID and insurance card. That simple movement, reaching into her bag, triggered a chain of events that would change multiple lives forever. The security guard, Derek Morrison, a 34-year-old man with minimal training and a head full of prejudices, saw her reach into her purse and immediately assumed the worst. His limited experience and biased worldview told him that a black woman in a pharmacy late at night reaching into a bag could only mean one thing: robbery. Without following proper security protocols, without calling for backup, without even asking a simple question, Morrison drew his weapon and pointed it directly at Dr. Washington. "Get your hands where I can see them," Morrison shouted, his voice cracking with adrenaline and misplaced authority. The pharmacy fell silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the soft gasp from the elderly customer who quickly moved behind a display of vitamins. Dr. Washington froze, her hand still partially in her purse, her mind racing between disbelief, fear, and a familiar rage that came from being treated like a criminal for existing while black. She had been through implicit bias training, had read countless studies about how people like her were perceived as threats even in professional settings, but experiencing it at gunpoint was a different kind of violation entirely. "I'm a doctor," she said slowly, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "I'm here to pick up my prescription. My ID is in my purse." Morrison's grip tightened on his weapon, his training, what little he had, failing him completely. He had been hired by the pharmacy security company just 3 weeks earlier, after a cursory background check that missed his history of complaints from previous jobs, his tendency toward aggressive behavior, and his complete lack of proper de-escalation training. "I don't care what you say you are," he snarled, his voice carrying years of resentment and prejudice. "Slowly take your hand out of that bag and put both hands on the counter." The pharmacist, Maria Rodriguez, watched in horror as the situation escalated. She knew Dr. Washington, had filled her prescriptions for months, had even thanked her once for saving her nephew's life in the emergency room. "Derek, stop," she called out. "I know her. She's a doctor at Metropolitan General." But Morrison was beyond reason now, his weapon trained on a woman whose only crime was seeking medical care while black. Dr. Washington complied with his demands, moving slowly and deliberately, her hands visible, her medical training kicking in as she tried to remain calm and assess the threat level of a clearly unstable individual with a gun. As Dr. Washington's hands emerged from her purse, she held not a weapon or stolen goods, but her hospital ID badge, her medical license, and her prescription bottle from a previous refill. The items scattered slightly on the counter as she placed them down, her movements careful and deliberate. Morrison squinted at the items, his weapon still trained on her, his mind struggling to process information that contradicted his prejudiced assumptions. The hospital ID showed her clearly: Dr. Amelia Washington, Emergency Medicine, Metropolitan General Hospital. Her medical license, recently renewed, bore the official state seal and her photograph. The prescription bottle from last month had her name, address, and the same medication she was trying to refill tonight. "That don't mean nothing," Morrison said, though his voice carried less certainty now. Those could be fake. Anyone can get fake IDs made. The pharmacist, Maria, stepped forward despite the dangerous situation. Derek, I'm telling you, she's really a doctor. She's been coming here for months. She saved my nephew's life in the ER last year when he had that motorcycle accident. Put the gun down, you're making a huge mistake. The elderly customer, Mr. Harold Chin, an 82-year-old retired teacher, pulled out his phone and began recording despite his shaking hands. He had lived through enough history to recognize the significance of this moment, and something told him this footage might be important later. Dr. Washington remained motionless, her medical training helping her stay calm while her mind raced through the implications of this encounter. She thought about her patients who depended on her mother who had worked 3 jobs to put her through medical school, her younger brother who looked up to her as proof that they could rise above society's limited expectations. She also thought about Breonna Taylor, Atashiana Jefferson, and countless other Black women who had been victims of similar assumptions and violent overreactions. I'm going to reach for my phone, she said quietly, to call my supervisor at the hospital. He can verify who I am. Dr. Washington slowly reached for her phone, every movement deliberate and visible, while Morrison's gun remained pointed at her chest. She dialed Dr. James Patterson, the chief of emergency medicine at Metropolitan General, knowing he would be awake. He was always awake, managing the night shift from his office. Dr. Patterson, this is Amelia Washington, she said when he answered. I'm at Preston's Pharmacy on 5th Avenue, and I need you to verify my identity to someone here. She explained the situation in medical terminology, using coded language that any healthcare professional would understand, but that would clearly establish her credentials. Put them on the phone, Dr. Patterson said immediately, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life and death situations. Dr. Washington looked at Morrison. My supervisor wants to speak with you. Morrison, now beginning to realize that his assumptions might be catastrophically wrong, reluctantly took the phone while keeping his weapon trained on her. This is Dr. James Patterson, Chief of Emergency Medicine at Metropolitan General Hospital, came the authoritative voice through the speaker. The woman you're confronting is Dr. Amelia Washington, one of our finest emergency physicians. She just completed a 16-hour shift saving lives, and she's been a member of our medical staff for 3 years. If you don't lower that weapon immediately and apologize to her, you'll be hearing from our legal department, the hospital administration, and every medical organization in this city. The pharmacist, Maria, seized the moment. Derek, you need to put that gun down right now. You're threatening a doctor who helps people. This is completely wrong. Mr. Chin continued recording, his hands steadier now, understanding that he was documenting something that could have serious legal implications. Morrison's hand began to shake as the reality of his mistake became clear. He had drawn a weapon on a respected medical professional, based solely on his racial prejudices and assumptions. But instead of immediately apologizing and de-escalating, his pride and embarrassment made him double down on his error. I don't care if she's a doctor or the president, Morrison said, his voice growing more aggressive as his embarrassment deepened. She could still be up to something. Doctors can be criminals too. His words revealed the depth of his prejudice and his unwillingness to accept that he had made a terrible mistake. Dr. Patterson's voice came through the phone speaker, now cold with anger. Young man, you are currently threatening a physician who has saved dozens of lives, including 3 children just this evening. Dr. Washington has an impeccable record, and your behavior is not only illegal but morally reprehensible. I'm calling the police right now. Morrison's face flushed red. You don't call the police on me. I am security. But his authority was clearly illegitimate, his position as a barely trained guard giving him no right to hold anyone at gunpoint without cause. Dr. Washington, drawing on her emergency room experience dealing with unstable individuals, spoke calmly. Sir, I understand you're trying to do your job, but you've made an error in judgment. I'm not a threat to anyone. I'm a physician trying to get medication for my migraines so I can return to work tomorrow and continue helping people. The situation was rapidly spiraling beyond Morrison's control. The pharmacist was now on her own phone calling 911, the elderly customer was recording everything, and a respected doctor was being held at gunpoint for the crime of existing while black in a pharmacy. Morrison's inadequate training had prepared him for shoplifters and minor disturbances, not for the complex situation he had created through his own bias and poor judgment. What he didn't realize was that Dr. Washington carried more than just medical credentials in her purse. As a black woman working in high-stress emergency medicine, she had learned to protect herself in ways that went beyond medical training. Her badge wasn't just a hospital ID. It represented years of fighting against exactly this kind of prejudice, and she had resources and allies that Morrison couldn't imagine. As Morrison continued to hold Dr. Washington at gunpoint, she calmly reached for another item in her purse, a second badge that Morrison hadn't noticed. "I need to show you something else," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. In addition to being an emergency room physician, Dr. Washington held a position that Morrison couldn't have anticipated. She was a commissioned medical officer with the U.S. Public Health Service, a uniformed service that gave her federal law enforcement authority in medical emergencies and public health situations. Her second badge bore the insignia of the Surgeon General's office and identified her as Lieutenant Commander Amelia Washington, USPHS. "This badge," she said, holding it clearly visible, "gives me federal authority to investigate threats to public health and safety. Right now, you're threatening a federal officer in the commission of her duties." Morrison's face went pale as he processed this information. The pharmacist, Maria, stopped talking to 911 to stare at the badge. Mr. Chen adjusted his phone to get a better view of the federal credentials. The situation had just become exponentially more serious for Morrison. Dr. Washington continued, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used when directing trauma teams. "Under federal law, threatening a commissioned officer of the Public Health Service is a felony. The Patriot Act includes specific provisions about interfering with public health officials. You're not just threatening a doctor, you're threatening a federal officer, and that carries a minimum sentence of 10 years in federal prison." Morrison's hand holding the gun began to tremble. His simple-minded prejudice had led him to threaten not just a respected physician, but a federal law enforcement officer. The security company that hired him with minimal background checking was about to face a federal investigation. The pharmacy would likely lose their security contract, and Morrison himself was looking at federal charges that would end his life as he knew it. "But here's what's going to happen," Dr. Washington continued, pulling out her phone to make another call. "I'm calling the FBI field office, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the Inspector General for the Department of Health and Human Services. This incident will be investigated at the federal level." Dr. Washington's call to the federal authorities was brief and professional. "This is Lieutenant Commander Washington, USPHS, badge number 7849. I'm being held at gunpoint by a security guard at Preston's Pharmacy, 1247 Fifth Avenue. I need immediate federal response." Within minutes, the situation at the pharmacy transformed. Morrison, now fully understanding the magnitude of his error, finally lowered his weapon, but it was too late. The damage was done, and federal wheels were already in motion. The first to arrive were local police, followed quickly by FBI agents and U.S. Marshals. The small pharmacy became a crime scene, with federal investigators documenting everything: Morrison's improper use of force, the racial profiling, the threat to a federal officer, and the complete failure of security protocols. Agent Sarah Collins, a 15-year FBI veteran specializing in civil rights violations, took charge of the scene. She interviewed each witness separately, collected Mr. Chen's video evidence, and documented Morrison's weapon, his employment history, and his complete lack of proper training. The security company that employed Morrison, SecureGuard Incorporated, would face federal investigation for their hiring practices, training failures, and negligent supervision. Morrison was placed under arrest, not just for threatening Dr. Washington, but for violating federal laws regarding interference with a public health official. His booking photo and charges would become part of a federal case file that would follow him for the rest of his life. The U.S. Attorney's Office moved quickly, as they always did with cases involving threats to federal officers. Within 48 hours, Morrison was indicted on multiple federal charges: threatening a federal officer, interference with a commissioned officer of the Public Health Service, civil rights violations under federal hate crime statutes, and brandishing a firearm in the commission of a federal crime. Each charge carried significant prison time, and federal crimes meant no possibility of early parole. The case became a textbook example of how racial profiling could escalate into federal crimes with life-altering consequences. The federal investigation into Morrison's actions revealed a pattern that went far deeper than one night at a pharmacy. FBI agents discovered that Morrison had a history of complaints from previous security jobs, complaints that had been ignored or covered up by employers more concerned with liability than justice. They found text messages on his phone containing racist language and conspiracy theories. They uncovered his social media posts expressing views about Black professionals that explained his assumption that Dr. Washington must be a criminal. The investigation also revealed systemic problems with SecureGuard Incorporated, the company that employed Morrison. Federal investigators found that the company routinely hired guards with minimal background checks, provided virtually no bias training, and failed to supervise their employees adequately. The company's insurance policies were inadequate to cover federal civil rights violations, meaning they faced potential bankruptcy. Dr. Washington, meanwhile, became a reluctant symbol of the intersection between racial profiling and professional competence. Medical associations across the country issued statements supporting her, and the American Medical Association announced new initiatives to protect healthcare workers from discrimination. The U.S. Public Health Service used her case to highlight the dual challenges faced by minority federal officers. The pharmacy itself faced scrutiny for their choice of security company, but Maria Rodriguez, the pharmacist who had defended Dr. Washington, was praised for her courage in speaking up. The elderly customer, Mr. Chen, became an unexpected hero when his video recording provided crucial evidence for the federal case. Legal experts noted that Morrison's case represented a perfect storm of bad decisions, racial profiling escalating to armed threat, inadequate training leading to federal crimes, and personal prejudice resulting in career-ending consequences. The federal charges meant that Morrison would be tried in U.S. District Court, where federal judges had little tolerance for civil rights violations and where sentences were typically much harsher than in state court. The federal trial of Derek Morrison became a landmark case in civil rights enforcement. The U.S. Attorney's Office, led by prosecutor Jennifer Martinez, presented overwhelming evidence of Morrison's racial bias, improper use of force, and threats against a federal officer. The courtroom was packed with civil rights advocates, medical professionals, and members of the public following the case. Dr. Washington's testimony was compelling and precise. She described not just the events of that night, but the broader context of racial profiling in healthcare settings and the additional challenges faced by Black federal officers. Her credentials were impressive: emergency medicine physician, federal public health officer, and a woman who had dedicated her life to saving others, only to be threatened by someone who saw her skin color before her service. The defense attorney, faced with overwhelming evidence including video recording, federal officer testimony, and Morrison's own social media posts, attempted to argue that Morrison was simply doing his job. But federal prosecutor Martinez methodically destroyed this defense, showing that Morrison had no reasonable suspicion, had failed to follow basic security protocols, and had escalated a routine pharmacy visit into a federal crime. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological impact of racial profiling, the legal requirements for security guards, and the serious nature of threats against federal officers. Morrison's own social media posts were entered into evidence, revealing years of racist attitudes that explained his actions that night. The trial lasted 3 days. The jury, composed of citizens who understood both the seriousness of federal crimes and the reality of racial bias, deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Federal Judge Patricia Chin, no relation to the witness, accepted the jury's verdict and scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. Morrison's conviction on federal charges meant that his life, as he had known it, was over. Federal convictions carried mandatory minimum sentences, would prevent him from ever owning firearms again, and would make him virtually unemployable in security or law enforcement. 6 weeks later, Morrison stood before Federal Judge Chun for sentencing. The courtroom was again packed, with Dr. Washington present to witness the conclusion of a case that had transformed her from victim to symbol of justice. Judge Chen reviewed the case thoroughly before delivering her sentence. "Mr. Morrison," she began, "your actions on the night in question represent not just a failure of judgment, but a willful violation of the civil rights of a federal officer who has dedicated her life to serving others." Dr. Washington was guilty of nothing more than seeking medical care while Black, and your response was to threaten her life based solely on racial prejudice. The judge sentenced Morrison to the maximum allowed under federal guidelines, 12 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. He was permanently banned from working in security or law enforcement, required to attend bias training, and ordered to pay substantial restitution to Dr. Washington for emotional distress and legal fees. The security company, SecureGuard Incorporated, faced their own consequences. Federal civil rights violations voided their insurance coverage, and they filed for bankruptcy within 6 months. The company's executives faced personal liability for their negligent hiring and training practices. Preston's Pharmacy, while not directly liable, terminated their contract with SecureGuard and implemented new policies for security services, including mandatory bias training and strict protocols for any security interactions with customers. Dr. Washington returned to her work at Metropolitan General Hospital, where she was promoted to Assistant Chief of Emergency Medicine. She used her experience to advocate for better protection of healthcare workers and federal officers from discrimination. She also became a consultant for businesses wanting to improve their bias training and security protocols. The case became required reading in law schools studying civil rights enforcement, business schools examining corporate liability, and medical schools discussing discrimination in healthcare settings. Morrison's life forever ended, not through violence, but through the proper application of federal law and the consequences of his own choices. His federal conviction followed him to prison, where he had 12 years to contemplate how racial prejudice and poor judgment had destroyed his freedom, his career, and his future. Meanwhile, Dr. Washington continued saving lives, her badge, both medical and federal, representing not just her authority, but her triumph over those who would judge her by anything other than her character and service.